All right, all right. Hello, everybody out there in radio land and internet land as well. This is Rhymes Media Group, Rhymes Reasons, and I am Dr. Edward Rhymes. Glad you tune in today. It's been a busy week. I mean, it's only Tuesday and it's been a busy week. Anytime an NSA director hands in, a national security director hands in his resignation. It has been a busy week. Um, Michael Flynn, Trump's pick for uh, the National Security uh, uh, Council's director, handed in National Security, excuse me, advisor, handed in his resignation because it was discovered through phone taps, mind you, by the FBI, that which is problematic in and of itself, that he was discussing before Trump took office about easing the sanctions against Russia. Now, I know that some will be tempted to, talk about this in the vein of, hey, this really proves that, Russia was behind Trump being elected as president. I don't happen to think so. I really don't happen to think that's, has anything to do with that. But it is, fodder for rumor. It's fodder for the rumor mill, of course. Um, and so, I mean, how appropriate is it that we will be having uh, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos on our program today? Now, Dr. Papadopoulos is the publisher and editor of Politics First, a nonpartisan bi-monthly magazine published by First Publishing Limited. It provides first-rate coverage and analysis of the pressing political issues in Britain and the wider world, with contributors and columnists spanning the higher echelons of government, business, governance, media, law, and academia. Politics First is an indispensable read for anyone in Whitehall, Westminster, and I might add in the United States. We need to be more in tune to what's going on around the world and not try to just limit it to our own, petty or our own insular concerns. The world has gotten a whole lot smaller. We are a big part of that world, and we need to know about what's going on around us. And Dr. Papadopoulos is one of those minds that can help us to dissect, especially these things that are happening between us and Russia right now. So, Dr. Papadopoulos is a regular television and radio commentator on networks such as the BBC, RT, Press TV, and many more, specializing in Russia and the rest of the former Soviet Union, the former Yugoslavia, Syria, and British politics. He holds a PhD in Russian Soviet history from Royal Holloway. Now, I've listened to him talk a great deal. He's one of the clearest voices on what is taking place in Syria, one of the clearest voices on this new Red Scare, this what I would consider this new McCarthyism, where there's a Russian hacker under every bed now in the U.S. So he is one of those clear voices that I'm happy to have on. I'm happy to have on blog, not on Blog Talk Radio, but on Rhymes Reasons on Blog Talk Radio and on Facebook Live right now. I decided to give Facebook Live another shot because if those out there who really say they support this program, to support this work, will actually support it. It can work here. It can work here, but nothing works without our support, ladies and gentlemen. I hope we've learned by now, not just when it comes to Rhymes Media Group. I'm just a little dot on this vast scale in this vast cosmic universe of media and independent media. But what we need to learn, if we haven't learned already, we need the support of the people to make these ventures work. Mainstream media has failed and failed miserably in many ways. They want to blame, quote unquote fake news. They want to blame everybody else, but they won't take any responsibility for why people have lost faith in them. They want to blame Donald Trump, with the alternative facts saying, I don't agree with that nonsense any more than, you do. But the mainstream media at times has done an extremely poor job of reporting. They have shown their, let's say, their partisanship. You know, MSNBC is prone to it, CNN is prone to it, and Fox News is prone to it. And depending on who's in office, one of those three networks are going to carry the water for whatever administration is in office. You know, when Bush was in there, it was Fox carrying the water. When Obama was in office, it was MSNBC carrying the water. This is why they lost people like Cenk Uygur, MSNBC did, because he wouldn't toe the line. He had some viable and some very, you know, real problems with the Obama administration, just like I had, just like, you know, any honest person would. There were things that we looked at in his administration and said, no, that's wrong. And because the same thing happened in George Bush's administration. I saw those same people saying it was wrong when Bush was president. Now, those same voices became stilled and quiet when Obama was in office. We can't afford to play it that way. But getting back to the support of independent media, if independent media is going to work, you're going to have to make it work. If you say you want voices that are not, you know, tied to a corporation or voices that are not tied to a political party, then you've got to support that. There's no such thing as, okay, I'm so happy we have independent media without you all supporting it. It doesn't work that way, ladies and gentlemen. It simply doesn't. So, as now what you're going to hear right now is one of those unique moments. It is a unique moment because you're going to hear me call Dr. Papadopoulos, and we're going to dial him up right now. All right. You'll hear it ringing. You'll hear it. It'll sound like that. Contacting. There you go. There's the ring. You hear it? Yes. And now we'll get Dr. Papadopoulos in London, mind you. Told you the world is getting smaller.
Hello there, Edward.
Hello there, Marcus. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How about yourself?
All right. I was just bragging about you.
It started the show then, has it?
Oh, you're going to live up to it, I know.
I hope so.
I was just talking about, and I don't know if you've been, I know you know, with your magazine and All Politics First, I know you cover, you know, Britain's politics, but I know you also keep an eye on ours here in the States as well. So Michael Flynn is fired. It's fired. Now they say he resigned. You know he was fired.
Yes, Michael Flynn, of course.
Gives his letter of resignation to the Trump administration because it was discovered, because the FBI had basically tapped his phones, it was discovered that he was making plans about alleviating some of the sanctions against Russia before Trump took office. I want to know what your insights on that. Now, does this prove the point of the people who want to point to Russia as having a very big role in our elections this past November? Does this pretty much prove that Trump was in bed with Putin all along, and Putin made it possible for him to come, you know, to him to gain the White House? Is there a Russian hacker under every bed of every voter in the U.S.? Is that how this works? Tell me.
Well, I don't think it proves anything at the moment. Okay. I think that what we're seeing is a very, very complicated picture, and we need really to see what comes of the whole scandal, if we can call it a scandal, regarding Michael Flynn. Let's see if at some stage the FBI, for example, releases the audio of the conversations that Mr. Flynn had with the Russian ambassador in Washington, D.C. I think until that happens, it's just going to be speculation, and of course speculation is futile.
It is. Now,
Mm.
what else I wanted to ask you is that piggybacking on that, because I've heard you talk about this, and I would like you to share this with our audience here. Isn't it a bit hypocritical as we are, I mean, this is the exact number, and I think that we need to say the number every time we talk about what happened during the Obama administration. In 2016 alone, 26,171 bombs in 7 different countries that we know of.
Yes.
Isn't it a bit
Yes.
hypocritical for us to talk about people interfering in the affairs of other countries? I mean, doesn't that kind of ring hollow when we talk about Russia's presumed, interference with our election and our internal affairs?
I agree with you 100%, Edward. It is completely hypocritical, and it is totally ironic. America is the leading violator of international law in the world. If we go back just say 20, 25 years, we see the damage that America has inflicted on the world and has inflicted on international law, specifically the United Nations Charter. The old Yugoslavia descended into civil war because of American actions. For example, recognizing the independence of Bosnia. We see the bombing of Serbia in 1999, which was not approved by the United Nations Security Council. We then can go to the illegal invasion of Iraq and the subsequent illegal occupation of Iraq. Then we can move to Libya. Then we can move to Ukraine, where a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown in a Western-backed coup, which had the fingerprints of Washington all over it. And then we can have a look in Syria to the present day, where the American government, even under Trump, is continuing to support Islamist terrorist groups. So it's quite ironic for the Americans to accuse a foreign country of interfering in their domestic affairs when it is America who is the #1 guilty party of doing that. And you know, Edward, I'd like to make another point as well.
Go right ahead.
During the 1990s, the Americans had their man in the Kremlin, and I'm talking about Boris Yeltsin.
Yes.
Not many people make that equation.
No.
That Boris Yeltsin was subservient to the American government. He gave them 120% of everything they demanded, and also the director of the FSB, which was actually the FSK at that time in the early 1990s, which of course is the main successor to the KGB. It's the Federal Security Service. Now, he is regarded by the Russian intelligence services as having been a traitor because he gave the CIA so much sensitive material that it compromised Russian intelligence activities in the 1990s and inflicted a lot of damage on the Russian intelligence community. So let me make this very, very clear. We're hearing a lot of talk about how Trump is Putin's man, how the Russians have incriminating evidence on Trump. All I will say is this: we need to see the evidence. And secondly, do you know, Edward, in the world of espionage, anything is possible. But what is absolutely clear-cut and cannot be refuted is that the Americans had their man in the Kremlin and in the FSB during the 1990s, and that should be clearly stated.
Yeah. I mean, how can you ignore the fact that the Clinton administration propped up Boris Yeltsin and even backed him he blew up the Russian parliament? I mean,
Yes, I mean, that's. I mean, one of the big differences between Gorbachev and Yeltsin is that Gorbachev just could not resort to violence. It just it's not in his makeup.
No.
However, Yeltsin, who was projected by the Americans and the British, etc., as being this wonderful democrat, he had no moral compunction in using violence. And of course, at the end of 1993, he shelled the Russian parliament because he wanted to reduce the powers of the Duma, and he wanted to transfer those powers to himself. And the West turned a blind eye to those actions of Boris Yeltsin at the end of 1993.
Yeah, indeed. I think what you just did here, giving us the context, because I think we analyze the present without the historical context, and we draw conclusions. You know, being a old history professor myself, drawing those conclusions without the background, the backdrop upon which it happened.
Yes, and may I say this very quickly, Edward?
Go right ahead.
It's particularly worrying that America has a president, President Trump, who isn't interested in reading, apart from books on himself, and doesn't have the slightest bit of interest in history. No. And, you know, for a politician, for a leader of any country, not to have an interest in history is very, very worrying. Now, I'm not saying that if an American president did have an interest in history, then all would be well. No, it wouldn't. When it comes to American foreign policy, I despise all American presidents because they simply follow the line. That American global hegemony has to be protected at all costs. But having said that, the fact that Trump doesn't read, the fact that Trump has no interest in history, I find that quite alarming.
Yeah, well, I find it quite alarming, Marcus, when the average U.S. citizen doesn't. Extremely alarming when the president of the United States doesn't.
Yes, absolutely.
Talk to us a little bit about Syria. Talk to us about let's take the TikTok, what they would call the TikTok and government speak, from our involvement in the States here, our involvement as the American government's involvement to current day Syria. Take us from our involvement through, trying to topple, the beginning of trying to topple Assad and so forth. Take us there and walk us through to where we are today, because I think we need that sort of perspective.
Yes. Well, first of all, Syria has been pursuing an independent foreign policy for well over 50 years. And for nearly 50 years, Syria has maintained a very close relationship with Russia. Well, first of all, Soviet Union, and then Russia. A very close political, economic, military and intelligence relationship. We can say with confidence that Syria is Russia's eyes and ears in the Middle East. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because we know that Israel is America's eyes and ears in the Middle East. So that's very, very important to establish. Also, Syria has a very close relationship with Iran. And thirdly, Syria is an arch enemy of Israel. And of course, Israel has a very, very close strategic relationship with America. So that's the sort of the history with Syria in a nutshell. Now, if we fast forward to 2011, when the violence in Syria began. Now, I'm not going to say that the Americans instigated the initial violence in Syria. I'm not going to say that the Americans instigated the Arab Spring. We need to have concrete evidence, persuasive evidence to make that point. However, Edward, I will say this. The Americans are opportunists. And they saw an opportunity in Syria when the violent protests erupted. They saw an opportunity to bring down the Syrian government, and by bringing down the Syrian government, that would end Russia's influence and power in the Middle East. That would severely weaken Iran's influence and power in the Middle East. Hezbollah eventually would become a spent force, and Israel would lose an arch enemy. So the Americans once again began supporting Islamist terrorists. Now, they have a long history of supporting Islamists. It goes back to the 1980s in Afghanistan when the Russians were fighting the Mujahideen. Yes. Eventually it led to that, but it was the Mujahideen they were supporting. And of course, one of their main people they were supporting, the Mujahideen, was of course Osama bin Laden, and that is a fact. That's irrefutable.
Exactly.
The Americans facilitated the arrival of the Mujahideen into Bosnia during the Bosnian Civil War to fight against the Bosnian Serbs, and of course the Americans via the French and the British supported Islamist groups against Colonel Gaddafi in Libya in 2011. So going back to Syria, the Americans started supporting with military equipment, with intelligence and logistical help, various Islamist terrorist groups in Syria. And so did their allies in the region, the Turks, the Saudis and the Qataris. And of course, one of the most potent Islamist terrorist groups that the Americans were supporting was al-Nusra. And we can say as well that ISIS, which of course was born out of the American invasion of Iraq, when ISIS began advancing in Syria late in 2013, there was no condemnation by the Americans of the growing power of ISIS in Syria. It's only when ISIS began advancing in Iraq when the whole world heard about how evil ISIS was, which of course it is, but the Americans were quite content to see the Syrian army being defeated by ISIS. So the Americans, since 2011, have been pursuing an objective of trying to bring down the Syrian government, trying to bring down Syria's President Assad, to destroy the Syrian state and replace it with a compliant pro-Western one. Now, that alone is responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Syrian civilians. The Americans have instigated a terrible, terrible conflict in that country. And they are going to fail in their objective. And I think people in Washington understand that since the Russian military entered the conflict, that is the end of Washington's goal of trying to bring about the end or the downfall of the Syrian government. But, you know, Edward, at the same time, the double consequence, the double effect of Washington's support for these hideous groups in Syria has been to make the threat of Islamist terrorism all the more potent, not just in the Middle East, not just in North Africa, but also in Europe, and also, it has to be said, in America as well. They have armed these people to the teeth. They have trained them with the know-how of how to kill, how to make bombs, how to detonate these bombs, how to move around from one area to another area. These are the consequences of the malignant American foreign policy towards Syria.
This is what we did some time ago in places like the Honduras, Nicaragua. We used death squads to do that. Using the School of Americas to train these individuals to wreak havoc in that region. It seems that we flipped it somewhat, and now we're using Islamist terrorists, Wahhabist, to do the bidding now. Just to, you know, we're just using a different team now than the one that we used back in the 70s and the 80s and so forth. So That was a
yes,
wonderful.
and we should also say as well that yes, the Americans have used right-wing death squads in Latin America. I would also add El Salvador to that as well.
Exactly.
Yes, they use Islamist terrorist groups to achieve their objectives, but also as well, during the conflict in Kosovo, they used the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was not just a terrorist organization, but an organized crime organization, which has been supported by Interpol, which has been supported by numerous intelligence agencies around the world. The KLA was a leading organization in drug trafficking, in gun trafficking, and of course in the sex trade. And numerous senior representatives from Interpol regard Kosovo today as a black hole in Europe. And of course, the president of Kosovo today, Hashim Tashi, is a former organised crime leader, and I say former in a very loose way. He's maintained those titles. So the Americans also use organised crime to achieve their objectives.
Well, yeah, I mean, you look at Karzai and his brother, and in Afghanistan. I mean,
yes.
We could go on. I mean, how they use the mafia to try to kill Fidel Castro numerous times.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So I mean, they've shown no problem, no compunction in using those kind of shadowy figures to try to reach their objectives.
Vile people, absolutely repugnant people.
Exactly. So what I want to talk to you more about, you mentioned Kosovo, and I was reading a piece of yours from 2013 that talked about how, ordinary people in the West were not told that after Serbia lost control of Kosovo following the NATO bombing campaign against Belgrade and other Serbian cities in 1999, the region became a center point in Europe for the trafficking of people, drugs, and, most diabolically, organs. When Kosovo unilaterally declared its independence from Serbia in 2008, Western politicians hailed the event. How did they get it so wrong? And what happened? Tell us more about what happened in Kosovo, how Kosovo became this center point for such heinous activities.
Well, the Americans viewed and continue to view the Balkans as a very, very strategic region for themselves. Why did they play a leading role in breaking up the old Yugoslavia? Well, for two reasons. Number one, because they did not want a socialist economy in a post-communist Europe world. They, after the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, it was just Yugoslavia left, and the Americans did not want a socialist economy in existence in Europe. Secondly, the Americans were acutely aware that Yugoslavia was starting to orientate itself towards the Soviet Union Russia from 1990 onwards, and they did not want Russian influence in the Balkans because, of course, the Serbs and the Russians are historic allies, Pan-Slavism and also the Orthodox faith. So they initiated the breakup of Yugoslavia. Now, if we go to 1999, when the Serbia or the Yugoslav army and the Yugoslav police forces were fighting against the KLA in Kosovo, they had virtually defeated them, but the Americans saw an opportunity to weaken Serbia, which of course at that time was run by Slobodan Milosevic and who was pursuing close ties with Russia and with China. They wanted to weaken Serbia so that Slobodan Milosevic would fall and therefore they could have a compliant person in Belgrade. And of course, one way to do that was Kosovo, and the Americans also were very aware of the importance of having an American military base in Kosovo, and also Kosovo's immense natural resources. For example, the mines that are in Kosovo. They have real value to them. So. At the beginning of 1999, all of a sudden, the American State Department no longer recognized the KLA as a terrorist organization. Prior to that, the State Department recognized the KLA as a terrorist organization, and then it changed. And then the Americans started assisting the KLA, and of course, the bombing campaign began. And at that time, of course, Serbia, or the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, as it was then, was up against America and the rest of NATO. Russia could just give political support because, of course, at that time, Russia was on its knees. Russia, during the 1990s, descended into complete and utter meltdown, economically, politically, militarily, and, of course, in social terms. As well. So eventually, Belgrade agreed to a truce, and it meant the Yugoslav army and police forces having to leave Kosovo. And the Americans achieved their objective. And the Americans always knew amongst themselves that after some years, they would proclaim Kosovo as an independent state, which of course is what they did at the beginning of 2008. But in the meantime, they established Camp Bondsteel, which is one of the largest American military bases in the world. Off the top of my head, Edward, I think there's about 6,000 American soldiers stationed there. That's off the top of my head. You'd have to check that. But it is a massive base. And also what has happened is that the people running Kosovo now are from the former KLA. They are obviously organized crime leaders. And the drug trade, the gun trade, the sex trade and the organ trade, which you have rightly brought up, flourished. And Kosovo began exporting this vile trade to the whole of Europe. And so much so, Edward, that I believe it was 2003 or 2004, the Home Office in Britain said in a report that 70% of the drug trade, sex trade and gun trade in London was being carried out by Kosovan Albanian mafia groups. And that is the Home Office. That's not me saying it. That's not the Serbs saying it. That is a Home Office report, 70%. And of course, France, Paris in particular, has been another victim of this vile trade coming from Kosovo. And of course, the Americans turn a blind eye because they have gained a military presence. They've gained another military presence in the Balkans. They weakened Serbia so that 1 year later, after 1999, Slobodan Milosevic fell from power in an American-backed campaign against him. And today Serbia has a pro-Western president running it in the form of Alexander Vučić. So it's a very, very sad state of affairs, but it's very, very alarming as well.
What about the reports of neo-Nazis in places like Lithuania?
Yes.
As a result of us toppling the democratically elected, president in this country. What is the atmosphere? I mean, you talked about our military presence and other, but you talked about our removal of that president. What role is neo-Nazism playing in Lithuania? What's going on when it comes to that particular group?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say this, Edward. after the Second World War ended in 1945, the Red Army, or the Soviet Army as it was officially known as then, was fighting against a guerrilla warfare campaign in Western Ukraine, Galicia, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, and also in the Baltic States. Who were they fighting against? They were fighting against ultra-nationalist groups who had collaborated with the Nazis. And those groups were being supported from 1945 until the early 1950s, when eventually the Soviet Army crushed those groups. Those groups were being supported militarily and with intelligence by America and by Britain. So both countries had no moral compunction in supporting groups who had collaborated with the Nazis, and they supported these groups as soon as the Second World War ended. So we need to fast forward to the present. Of course, Ukraine is an independent country today, and the Baltic States are independent. What has been going on for at least 10 years and more, possibly sort of 15, 16 years, is a rewriting of the history of the Second World War in the Baltic States and in Western Ukraine in particular, because it's in Western Ukraine where you find anti-Russian sentiments. The rest of Ukraine is very, very different. So in those areas, the history books are being rewritten. The Red Army is being equated with the Wehrmacht. Communism is being equated with Nazism. And the liberation of the Baltic States and of Ukraine by the Soviet Army, which of course the Soviet Army comprised many Ukrainians and many people from the Baltic States, is not regarded as a liberation. It's regarded as an occupation. Now that has caused immense tension with Russia. And what we see today is a growth of neo-Nazis, stroke neo-fascists in the Baltic States and in Ukraine. And we can turn to independent people and organizations to support that. Historians of the Holocaust support that. They have made it very clear that these groups are becoming very large and very influential. The Simon Wiesenthal Center has testified to that. Yad Vashem has testified to that. Every year in Estonia and Latvia, there is a parade of SS veterans, and the European Union turns a blind eye to it. It says nothing. The Americans turn a blind eye to it. They say nothing. Now, why are the Americans and why is the European Union behaving in that way? Because those groups are vehemently anti-Russian, and they are strongly pro-Western and pro-NATO. And the Americans, once again, are using these neo-fascist, neo-Nazi groups to serve a purpose, to be on the front line against Russia. So they have resurrected their ties with these groups, resurrected them. I use that word because, as I said just now, they were supporting these groups from 1945 into the early 1950s, who were fighting against the Soviet Army.
So we got into, that's when we were in the whole Cold War territory. And we were, I would like to ask you to elaborate on the ways that they are comparing, Nazism to communism. You said that in the textbooks that they're equating Nazism with communism. I mean, how so?
Well, what the Baltic States are saying, the governments of the Baltic States are saying, is that the Nazis occupied us and committed terrible crimes against us. Though we shouldn't forget, of course, that the Baltic states are being quite deceptive with that, because they know very, very well that these nationalist groups today, which are very well represented in the governments in the Baltic states, are very proud of their ancestors past, when they collaborated with the Nazis.
Their ancestors were collaborators with the Nazis. I mean, you think about in Croatia, I don't mean to interrupt, but in Croatia, one of the most compelling things from that whole breakup of Yugoslavia is watching Tudjman kiss that checkered flag, which was such a great symbol of death to many Serbians.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, Tudjman was a Holocaust denier.
Right.
He was anti-Semitic. He made it very clear that he would never want his daughter to marry a Jew.
Right.
And of course, the Bosnian Muslim leader at that time, Alija Izetbegović, was very, very similar.
Right.
And the irony was that I think it was either at the beginning of 1994 or the beginning of 1994 was the opening of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And who was there alongside Clinton? Tudjman, and there was no Serbian representative, because of course the Serbs and the Jews, they shared a common fate during the Second World War. That was genocide.
Exactly.
And of course, let's not forget that the Americans were supporting the Croats in the 1990s against the Serbs. Just one of the military operations was, of course, Operation Storm in the summer of 1995. When the Croatian forces killed about 3,000 Croatian Serbs and expelled over 200,000. But if we go back to the Baltic states, they are saying that Nazism and communism were occupying forces, and they were murderous, and they had policies of extermination. Well, the Nazis certainly did. There's no question about it. But you cannot equate communism with Nazism. Yes, there was a lot of things which were wrong with communism, but there was a lot of things which were correct as well. For example, healthcare. For example, education. For example, the welfare state. For example, no homelessness. And the Baltic states benefited immeasurably because of that system. I mean, you have a look at the states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania today, and there's a complete brain drain there. So many people, in particular young people, are leaving those countries because there's no employment for them there. So it is simply untenable for them to argue that communism was the same as Nazism. But of course, the Americans and the European Union are backing the Baltic states when they make that argument, which is just increasing the tension with Russia. And as I said, we have the grotesque spectacle every year in Riga and in Tallinn of veteran SS parades. You have veterans who served in Waffen SS divisions during the Second World War, who committed terrible crimes against Soviet prisoners of war, against Soviet Jews and other Soviet civilians, and they are parading. If the same happened in Berlin, you wouldn't hear the end of it, and rightly so. But why is it that a veteran SS parade is not allowed in France or in Germany, but it's tolerated by the Americans and the Europeans in the Baltic states? Why? Because those people are vehemently anti-Russian, and the Americans and the Europeans are using them as a weapon against Russia.
What I find compelling and interesting, through my study of history, is that everywhere where people were given a choice between socialism, you say communism, and capitalism. You look at Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh.
Hmm.
Our own State Department said before uh, the, the whole 1956 unification was supposed to take place that Ho Chi Minh would have won by 80% in South Vietnam had they ran the presidential election. You look at places
Hmm.
like Nicaragua, where they overthrew the Somoza clan, and they introduced socialist reforms that actually helped to increase education and healthcare.
Yes.
Everywhere you look across the globe, where these people have had the opportunity, these citizens had an opportunity to vote in their countries, and they chose socialism, and it actually worked. It seems like the U.S. has always tried to overthrow those governments and have overthrown those governments when they have made that critical choice. There was also talk before Gaddafi was overthrown about him introducing some of those same things in Africa with other countries. Is
Yes.
doing what Latin America did, you know, with when Chavez was at his zenith, and
Yes.
those countries were working together. It seems that in every place where that sort of cooperation is taking place and those corporate interests are threatened, they
Yes.
overthrow and they try to topple and they destabilize every country. That has
Yes.
proven that those socialist, quote unquote, experiments have indeed worked. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. Of course, socialism stroke communism represents the ultimate threat to the American system. It represents the ultimate threat to the American way of life. And I don't want to come across as being offensive to Americans when I say this,
Go right ahead.
but you know, Edward, ultimately, the American system, the American way of life is this, in a nutshell: make as much money as you can, and by any means necessary, including walking all over people. Now, of course, socialism, communism is the complete opposite to that. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. When socialism, communism was taking ground in various countries after 1945, the Americans sought to act, and they intervened either directly or indirectly. And as you said, unfortunately, they were very successful in many cases, but also they were very unsuccessful. Look what happened in Vietnam. I mean,
Exactly.
the Americans were taught a lesson. And by the way, Vietnam is doing very, very well today, economically speaking. Of course, with Castro, initially it was a nationalist revolution. It's only when he befriended the Soviet Union that he proclaimed the revolution as a communist revolution. But nonetheless, the Americans saw what was happening, and they wanted to return Cuba to being the American brothel that it was under Batista, and they failed. So there's no question about it. When the Americans see something happening in the world which they regard as threatening American economic interests, or more widely speaking, threatening American global hegemony, they act. And they act ruthlessly, they act violently, and of course they act illegally. As I said at the beginning of this discussion, America is and will remain for the foreseeable future the number one violator of international law in the world. And when you have American politicians and journalists proclaiming America as a beacon of democracy and freedom and rule of law, etc., etc., you have to ask yourselves, are they simply just lying? Is it just for public consumption? Or are they deluded? Perhaps it's a bit of both.
Right, exactly. I have a couple of more questions to ask. I was wondering, and I look at your last name, Papadopoulos, Greek in origin?
Yes, my father was from Cyprus.
Yeah.
I'm half Greek Cypriot, and my mum is half English, half German. My German grandmother, she left Germany quite soon after Hitler came to power. I think she saw the writing on the wall quite soon and left initially for Switzerland, and then she made her way to Britain.
Did that creating you a yearning desire to really learn more about the Baltic states?
Yeah, well, I
Because
think that
you are extremely knowledgeable when it comes to the Baltic state, the history. I mean, it's
yeah,
fascinating.
well, I've had a passion for Russia since the age of about 7, and it didn't take long for me in my sort of mid-teens to decide that I wanted to study Russian history at university, and then I decided I wanted to become a doctor of Russian history. So, I mean, naturally, I'm very well acquainted with the history of the Baltic states, and I follow what's happening in the Baltic states currently as well. And I am very, very alarmed. I'm very alarmed by the rewriting of history there. I'm very alarmed by the emergence of neo-Nazis, neo-fascists there. And naturally, Edward, I'm very alarmed by the increase in NATO presence in the Baltic states, which is hardly conducive for peace. And unfortunately, Russia, the NATO presence in the Baltic states is a worry for Russia, a legitimate worry. At the moment, the military presence there of NATO is not enough to seriously threaten Russian national security. But that could change in a year. That could change in 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years. So we have to be very sympathetic to Russia, to what Russia is saying when it expresses concern about NATO's presence in the Baltic states.
Well, with the increasing what I would call the new Red Scare in this country, and
yes,
that the Democrats in this country actually began this whole new Red Scare when they couldn't explain to their corporate donors why, after giving them over $1 billion to win, they lost. And then they had to come up with this Russia, and this is my take on it. They had to come up with this Russia explanation as to why they lost the election, not just the White House, but the Senate, the Congress, and state legislatures too, and state governorships as well. A lot of those went Republican. So I mean, you would have to explain all that as well. So I look at this new Red Scare, and one of the things that has come out of this is, I don't know if you're familiar with the National Defense Authorization Act, that a new a provision was placed in that, the anti-propaganda bill, which basically establishes a ministry of truth that will, basically tell us what propaganda is, will tell us, who are, what media sources are being used by foreign governments and that sort of thing. Now, being a media person yourself, having your own, publishing apparatus, and being, independent. Does this alarm you in any way? Because it certainly alarms me. On that list that the Washington Post put out, talking about, news sources that are, like propaganda sources. I happened to work with two of those entities that ended up on the list. So yeah, I mean, does this concern you, or have you heard about that law? Does it concern you in any way?
Yes, it does concern me, but I have to say, Edward, I'm not surprised by it whatsoever. I mean, the fact that CNN or Fox News or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post project themselves as being objective, reliable news outlets. It's just simply a joke, and a bad joke, that as well. I mean, these are the media outlets who, of course, told us that 500,000 Kosovan Albanians had been murdered by the Serbs. Without ever having supported that. Exactly. And of course, we know that that was a complete lie. Well, these are the same media outlets that told us Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, these are the same people who told us that that the inhabitants of Benghazi were about to be slaughtered by Colonel Gaddafi's forces. Right. These are the same people, of course, that are telling us to this day that President Assad and the Syrian government are genocidal maniacs. They're murdering their own people, and that President Assad is intent on killing Sunnis, even though his own wife is Sunni, even though most of the Syrian high command are Sunnis. They don't actually account for that. But, you know, I believe...
If I may add, Marcus, the same media that also says, oh no, we're only giving weapons to the moderate forces.
Ah, yes, of course, yes, absolutely. Well, do you know, the only moderate fighting force, or the only two moderate fighting forces in Syria is the Syrian Arab Army and the Kurds. You know, the other groups who the Americans have been backing are Islamist terrorists, including the so-called Free Syrian Army. But, you know, you see, how do we account for them saying that this organisation is fake news and that organisation is fake news? How do we account for that? Well, I'll give you my opinion, Edward, because Western mainstream media, be it the American variant or the British variant, they understand that the days of the 1990s, when Western media was dominant and had no rivals in the world, they know those days are over. They're dead and buried. And while I'm not saying that Western media is a spent force, no, it is still a formidable force. It is still a formidable tool of the American government and the British government. The point is this: they are not the force that they used to be. They don't have the field to themselves anymore. You know, if we talk about television news channels, we have RT, we have Press TV, and if we talk about other alternative media sources, for example, we have your own program. You know, programs like yours were not in existence in the 1990s. No. There was no way for people to listen to an alternative version of what is happening in the world. So they feel threatened. Western media feels threatened, and what do they resort to? Well, they resort to try and denigrate their rivals by saying fake news or Putin apologists or just simply the Kremlin's propaganda machine. Well, do you know, we can just simply turn that around and say, well, CNN and Fox News is a weapon of the American government. We could say that BBC News and Sky News is a weapon of the British government. You know, we can turn that argument against them as well. But the fact is that they feel threatened to this day. They don't have that dominance anymore. They don't have the field to themselves. And we should actually be rejoicing in this. You know, do I care that they say RT, for example, is fake news propaganda? No, I don't care. Why don't I care? Because number one, I don't believe in that. And number two, RT has done a fabulous job in exposing the double standards, the folly and the malignant nature of American foreign policy. So these news outlets in America, they can say what they want. They know that in their lexicon, the good old days of the 1990s are over, and they are now being exposed on a regular basis.
Well, this has been my take on it all along, because what you see happening in America is a lot of our good journalists, dissidents, Chris Hedges, Seymour Hersh, I can name any number of others that were run out of media in this country and have found a home on places like Telesur, places like RT. They have found a home on places like that. Now, that's the biggest argument for me when you're losing Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. I'm not talking about hacks here. I'm talking about people who have done great investigative work. And their
Yeah.
investigation was turned against the wrong administration this time because the Obama administration went after journalists and national security whistleblowers like no administration has before.
Yes.
And so, I mean, he actually used the Espionage Act, the 1917 Espionage Act, twice as much as all of his predecessors combined. Not just twice as
Yes.
much as all his predecessors, if any predecessor, but all of his predecessors combined. So when I see things like that, and when I see dissidents and great journalists leaving the state's media here in the U.S. and going to
Hmm.
places where their message will be untethered, that's the
Yes.
biggest argument for me as to what's going wrong with media, with what's going wrong with Western media. That's been my biggest
Hmm.
argument all along. Now, I
Hmm.
want you to tell us more about, before we end here, I want you to tell us more about your news organization, Politics First. Tell us about that.
Yes, Politics First is a non-partisan magazine for the UK's Houses of Parliament. So it is a magazine written by MPs and peers and read by MPs and peers. I wear two hats in politics. The first one being the editor of Politics First, the second one being a television commentator, radio commentator, speech giver when it comes to international affairs, in particular Russia and the rest of the former Soviet Union, former Yugoslavia, and Syria. And I will say this, wearing my Politics First hat, I'm a member of the press gallery at the House of Commons, which of course means I have a full pass to Parliament. And it can be a slightly lonely existence for myself because my views don't come into Politics First.
Right.
I run articles by the Prime Minister, by the Defence Secretary, by the Foreign Secretary, which are scathing of Russia, for example, concerning Ukraine and Syria.
Right.
But certainly there are people at Parliament who have said to me before, "You're just a Kremlin mouthpiece. You're just Putin's mouthpiece at Westminster. You should be ashamed of yourself for supporting the Russian military campaign in Syria because they're killing children, they're bombing hospitals, etc., etc." All these malignant, nasty lies. But I think it's very important, Edward, for people to remain true to their convictions, and to be brave, and to be bold, and to keep on speaking out. Because if people were bullied into silence or intimidated into silence by some journalists and politicians that I have experienced that with, then the other side to the story, for example, Syria or Ukraine or Libya, would never come out. So we have to keep on fighting and fighting and fighting, and we are making significant progress. There is no question about it. The fact that you and I are having this discussion on your program now shows progress, because this wouldn't have happened in the 1990s. That was just not. It just wasn't an option. So we have to remain true to our convictions. We have to keep on making intelligent arguments, respectful arguments which can be corroborated and make them persuasive. And slowly but surely, more and more people are starting to question what they're told by the American government or by the British government. There is no question about it. I'm not saying that they have totally turned their backs on the British government or the American government, but the fact they're questioning is something. That is progress, because they didn't do that in the 1990s. They didn't do that leading up to the Iraq war. I mean, even though there was a serious protest in Britain, something like 2 million people, still the vast majority of British people did not question when Tony Blair made the made the case. We now know, well, we knew at the time, but we certainly know now that it was a lie, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. People weren't really questioning, but today people are questioning more. There's no question about that.
Exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been listening to Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. He is the publisher and editor of Politics First, a nonpartisan bi-monthly magazine published by First Publishing Limited. He is also a regular television and radio commentator on networks such as the BBC, RT, Press TV, Al Jazeera, and many more, specializing in Russia and the rest of the former Soviet Union, the former Yugoslavia, Syria, and British politics. Dr. Papadopoulos, this will not be the last time you are on this program. Thank you for adding so much depth and texture to these very critical issues that are happening around the globe. My audience has indeed been educated by this discussion, and I appreciate
I in turn, Edward, would like to thank you immensely for having invited me onto your program. I'd like to thank you immensely for the wonderful and informative series of discussions, the topics which we discussed today. I'd like to congratulate you on your program because, as I said, everyone has their part to play if we want to achieve a more just world, and I would be absolutely delighted to come back onto your program should you want me to.
Oh, I definitely want you to. That's not the question at all.
Thank you very much. I look forward to the next time then.
Okay, you take care now. Hey, I heard you coughing in the background. Get better, all right?
I certainly will. Thank you very much, Edwards.
Take care now. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Well, that was an extremely informative talk, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how you can come away from this discussion. Now, agree or disagree with the conclusions of Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. I don't happen to disagree with his conclusions. They're pretty much in sympathy and in step with my own on those issues. But whether you disagree or agree with him, you're going to have to disagree with him based upon fact because he has plenty in his arsenal. So he has said what I have been saying for quite some time now, is that we need programs such as this and others. We need independent media in this day and time where corporate media and media that's beholden to political or party interest are trying to drown out those voices. It's just that simple, ladies and gentlemen. And here's the thing. If I was beholden to corporate interest, and if I was beholden to party interest, I know I wouldn't have to ask for any money. That would be available to me for saying the things they would want me to say. No doubt. If I was willing to prostitute myself in that way, and I would look at it as that way, if I were to prostitute myself in that way, then yes, I wouldn't have to ask for one dime from my listeners. I wouldn't have to ask for one dime from the general public. But because it is independent media, and because it needs to stay independent media, and because we need to have independent voices not beholden to any of those interests, yes, we have to do the ugly thing such as ask for donations. And I don't apologize for that, just like I don't apologize for bringing you this program. So that does it for us here on Rhymes Reasons. Now is the end of the show, and Thelma Rhymes' grandbaby boy has got to go. God bless. Take care. Be safe.